So if we're talking about getting back to the basics of human nature, that's what the basics look like. People have just always been really creative with getting the most out of what we have. If there's any basic universal human truth about human nature to be had here, it's just that we do whatever works. Neanderthal Fat Factory. You love to see it, let's talk about it. Archaeologists in Germany have found a 125,000-year-old Neanderthal fat rendering plant, and as someone who does food handling and food supply chains for a living, and I'm also really interested in the history of my profession, I have thoughts. Also, just knowing that Neanderthals were so into saturated fat that they low-key industrialized to get as much of it as humanly possible, that makes me feel seen, heard, supported, so forth. Jokes aside, this place tells us some really interesting things. Like, some things are way older than you'd think. Food processing, for one. And getting so into it that we have divisions of labor and large scale, it's old. At least 100,000 years older than farming. Second, another thing that's really old is shelf-stable, high-calorie convenience foods. That's what rendered fat is. And third, thinking about labor and logistics, we had people doing this 125,000 years ago. And I just think that's really interesting. Now, if you've seen other news about this Neanderthal Fat Factory, you've probably seen it talked about as a way to avoid a health problem called rabbit starvation. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm just someone who does food handling for a living. Now with that caveat, I think what we're seeing at this Neanderthal fat rendering site might be way more interesting than just avoiding rabbit starvation. Let's talk about it. To catch you up, rabbit starvation is protein poisoning from eating too much protein and nothing else. No carbs, no fat. If you eat too much protein, your kidneys and your liver can't handle it. You get sick, and if it goes on long enough, you can die of malnutrition, even though you're technically getting enough calories. This paper explains that Neanderthals were mostly eating wild game, which is lean protein without a lot of fat. So that diet can easily get you into protein toxicity unless you find a way to get calories that aren't protein. That's why in English we call it rabbit starvation. European explorers kept getting themselves stranded in unfamiliar places, eating a lot of rabbits because they're common and pretty easy to catch, and then getting protein poisoning, because rabbits don't have much fat on them. So this paper's idea is the risk of rabbit starvation forced these Neanderthals to take extreme measures, like pounding apart bones to get the fat inside for extra calories. Now again, I'm not an archaeologist, but this paper says the fat rendering site was near forest where the main tree was hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are over 50% fat. If you need more calories from fat to balance out the protein, it's literally growing on trees. The campfires at this site had charred hazelnut and acorn shells in them, which suggests the Neanderthals were cooking these nuts. Acorns are full of carbs, and there were also lots of lakes and ponds in the area with cattails, which have edible starchy tubers, kind of like a potato. So this paper mentions that there are all these sources of carbs and fat in the area, and evidence of the Neanderthals cooking those plants. I don't know how you get from a campsite with clear signs of abundant carbs and nuts being prepared as food to, aha, they are only eating meat. The bone grease must have been their only way to avoid rabbit starvation. I don't know how you get there. Maybe they did some chemistry on some Neanderthal remains in the area in a different study and found some chemical signatures of an all-meat diet. But there are other ways that chemical signature can happen, like eating certain insects might give a chemical signature that looks like an all-meat diet. Again, I'm not an archaeologist. I am just someone who does food handling for a living. So I see how the way that we think about people in the past and how they ate informs a lot of the food trends that we have today, and how that can have real consequences for people's food decisions, their budgets, and their health. So it's really important that as much as we can with the data we have available, we try and get this right. And when you look at the history of how people got food, the further back we go, the more the record gets skewed to make it look like people only ate meat, even when they ate a lot of other things. Because killing and butchering large animals leaves behind lots of bones and stone tools, and those last a long time. In fact, the biggest bones from the biggest animals are the most likely to survive. That made it really easy for the first archaeologists to look at a campsite and go, ah, yes, mighty big game hunters. Because yeah, a lot of early humans did in fact eat a lot of mammoths and other large animals. There's actually an elephant kill site right by this Neanderthal Fat Factory where they butchered a straight-tusked elephant, which are enormous. They're a real contender for the biggest land animal ever. Taking one of those down is an impressive feat. But the remains of everything else they may have eaten, like mushrooms, berries, grass seeds, roots, and bugs, would have disappeared a long time ago. That's why we have this mental image of caveman lived on big game. And then that got solidified in pop culture. It's why we have a fad diet that's mostly meat, and we call it paleo. This skewed archaeological record isn't just an academic discussion. It's shaping bad and expensive health pseudoscience to this day. Now luckily, archaeologists have figured out how to find the traces of all those other things ancient people ate besides big game. Thanks to that, We're now getting a way better look at how ancient people's diet was usually more balanced than we first thought. But the archaeologists who do that can still sometimes be their own special little subfield, because at that point, you're sampling the soil and often looking for tiny little plant microfossils under a microscope. Not everybody does that. And maybe people who do that kind of archaeology just didn't get pulled in on this dig? I don't know. Again, not an archaeologist. Just a food handling nerd who's trying to understand the history of my trade. And also, I just want to see less of very cool archaeological finds getting turned into bogus ancestral eating health fads that cost a lot of money, have dubious health benefits, and may not even have that much to do with what these old timers actually ate. Hi, editing Sarah here. I just wanted to make a quick note. We're actually finding a lot of sites where Neanderthals and other ancient humans were cooking grains, legumes, and other foods that don't really fit the pop culture paleo diet concept. Also, if you're having a good time with this video, if you like this info, do give a like, subscribe, or drop a comment. It really helps more people see it and spread cool news about how people actually lived back in the day. Also, how reality is just a lot cooler than pop fiction sometimes. Also, please pardon the funky lighting. This room where I record is also the room where I start my seedlings, so there's a lot of lighting and space and grow lights to manage. We're getting it pretty one bit at a time. We're also playing host to this little creature, so it's very distracting. Back to Neanderthals. Okay, so to sum it up, avoiding rabbit starvation is how a lot of people are looking at this site right now, and now you've heard why I'm not so sure that's the right way to look at it. For what it's worth. Again, not an archaeologist. Now, let's look at what I do see going on here and why I think it might be way more interesting. Also, I know it sounds like I might be mad at the archaeologists or whatever. No, I'm so stoked that they found this. I'm just putting in my 2 cents as a food logistics nerd for anyone who cares about that kind of thing. So here goes. I think the fact that Neanderthals made themselves a little fat rendering factory has less to do with fighting off starvation and maybe a lot more to do with they might have been living in Fat City with an abundance of food. Rendering fat is a great way to take something that's kind of useless, like bones, and turn it into a shelf-stable, high-calorie convenience food that is portable, quick and easy to cook with, and tastes awesome. Because fat tastes good. And most of the work of turning bones into high-calorie convenience food can be done during slow times between hunts, or all the time by people who just didn't hunt. We know from a lot of early humans' remains that they did have starving times when there wasn't a lot of food. But we also know those hungry times weren't all the time. The site looks maybe less like a desperate move to avoid malnutrition in hard times, and more like it was about capturing abundance, which means they would have been planning ahead for the future, which is pretty smart. And maybe rendering fat out of bones was just about enjoying life and something that tasted good. This place also had stacks and stacks of elephant tusks just stashed around. Whether that was to make tools, trade with, or make art, we're not sure. I will say, a lot of the earliest artworks we found were carved in ivory because it's just soft enough to be easily carved, but hard enough to be durable and hold crisp edges. So yeah, I don't think the Neanderthals here necessarily made a fat rendering plant because they were desperate. Could have been, but not necessarily. They might have also just done it because things were going well. And it shows that they may have planned ahead for when things might not be so good, or when they might need to take long walks somewhere and have a high energy snack that they could take with them. It also might show that they thought about the best ways to make those high energy foods at volume. And that means they thought about food supply chains and labor logistics. And I think we can all learn something from that. Maybe something about what being a human is all about. Okay, so when we think about how ancient people got their food, we like to think about the big game hunting part, because it's cool. But getting a carcass is just step one. We don't think as much about what comes next, but we really should. If you are hunting large animals to stay alive instead of just for recreation, turning their remains into something you can keep and eat for more than a couple days is so important. That's why Neanderthals brought bones from their kills to this spot by the lake, pounded them to bits, and melted out the fat. Mostly jaws, skulls, ribs, and the ends of leg bones with red marrow. These bones have a lot of fat inside, but you have to break them apart to get it out. Smashing bones is so much work that these archaeologists really wanted to ask why they did it. And I think that's the right question, and I have some thoughts. 1, it's free real estate. It's more food from things you already killed. 2, people who aren't able-bodied adults can do it. It's a calorie-dense food that almost anyone can help make. And 3, rendered fat is good. It keeps for a long time and it tastes good. We have this idea that tasty, calorie-dense convenience foods are a modern invention. Degenerate, some might say, but that's not really the case. It's pretty common for hunter-gatherers to spend way more time processing food into shelf-stable, easy-to-eat, calorie-dense convenience foods than they do on the hunting and gathering part. Fish and meat, you gotta smoke them. Acorns, you gotta pound them into powder, put them in a bag, and leach them in a river for weeks or months to get the tannins out so they're edible. Maple sap, you gotta boil it down into a shelf-stable syrup or sugar cakes. Rendering fat from bones is 100% in line with this trend. I mean, think about it. If you're pulling all your food from wild sources, it's spotty, and you're often on the move from place to place, so it makes sense that processing food to make it storable for a long time, and distilling it down so you can carry it with you, and every gram is rich in energy. It makes sense that this would be one of the oldest human pursuits. So maybe it's not weird at all that Neanderthals were breaking down bones to melt down the fat. Maybe it's just weird that we think it's weird. Now, real quick, let's talk scale and logistics. Archaeologists found the remains of 172 or more large animals at this site, mostly horses or ox and deer. Funny enough, these Neanderthals definitely hunted elephants, but don't seem to have rendered elephant bones for fat. Maybe the bones were too big, or maybe carving up an elephant was already enough work that they didn't find rendering the fat out necessary. It also looks like the bones at this site were all brought there over a pretty short time, maybe about a year. Neanderthals lived in this general area for a few hundred years, but the fat factory itself was only used for a short time before it got buried and preserved. The archaeology team mapped out the bone and stone shards so you can see exactly where their workspaces were. And I love this map so much because you can see that their workspaces were about as far as you can reach when sitting in one place. It feels very familiar. I had this friend who would joke that when you're at work and really tired and don't want to get up, you can only really reach, the things right around you. And he would call that little radius you can reach the tyrannosphere. He's like T-Rex with little short arms. And you can see the little Neanderthal tyrannospheres on this heat map, and it kind of makes me feel things. The bones here are skewed towards the fatty ones, so it doesn't look like they just brought the whole animal here to butcher. They only brought the greasiest bones. This spot was high volume and 100% for fat rendering. I would guess they might have rendered fat from skin too. That wouldn't have left much archaeological evidence, but I do like to imagine that Neanderthals would have liked cracklins. To do rendering, you break up the bones, you slice up skin and other fatty, gristly tissues, then you heat them in water. The fat melts out and floats up to the top. Then when it cools and gets solid again, you can scoop it out and store it. The solid fat, think lard or tallow, can be stored long term. Now, Neanderthals didn't have pottery, as far as we know, but you can heat water in things like birch baskets or bags made from skin or organs like stomachs and bladders. You don't have to get it boiling hot to melt the fat and get it out. It just has to be nice and warm. Now again, this is a lot of work. You've got to break down those bones, but also tending fires, shooing scavengers away, getting firewood, hauling water from the lake, stowing finished fat batches, and making containers to stash it in. But this is also work that almost everyone can do at least one step of. We found a lot of Neanderthals who got serious injuries, healed because their people took care of them, and then lived long disabled lives, like Shanidar-1. It's the skeleton of a Neanderthal who had 1.5 arms, broken vertebrae that healed, a skull fracture that left him deaf and blind on one side, leg issues with a serious, painful limp. One of the things that people today find remarkable about how ancient people took care of their sick and injured was, wow, they must have loved people so much to take care of them even if they couldn't hunt. So there's a lot to unpack here. Morals aside, taking care of people who got hurt is basic how to have a team 101. How is someone supposed to even want to go hunting if they know that as soon as they break an arm doing it, the whole crew is just gonna shrug and go, sorry, you're useless now. Have fun dying. Bye. That's not how you do life. That's not how you keep a family together. So literally, Neanderthals were smarter than that. So when you see people today float the idea that being disabled, having chronic illness, and other people devoting time and attention and energy to taking care of sick people is a new, modern, weird, degenerate thing to do that's going to slow us all down and halt human progress? No, that's what we've always done. And that is what literally got us here. That's how we did progress as a species. So when people try to tell you that taking care of people is a silly new modern thing that we should abandon, they're not resurrecting ancient wisdom so much as they are inventing brand new stupid. And from how we can see, Neanderthals took care of very hurt people who might not ever heal. It probably wasn't all just about getting work out of them later. It was just about humanity and maybe some basic empathy, you know? Also, let's unpack this idea that you're either a mighty hunter or useless. Someone who is pretty beat up like Shanidar-1 could probably still tend fires, chuck rocks to scare off scavengers, things like that. Rendering fat might not be a desperation move. It might just be an extra job that people who are injured can do. Folks who are extra old or young, people who are caring for young children, that one guy who just breathes too loud and scares the deer away so you don't want to take him hunting, he could render fat. What I'm saying is, people really like to use this pop culture idea of ancient man, the mighty hunter, to push the idea that there's one kind of person who really matters the most, and that is big boys who can throw spear good. And in ancient times, everyone just depended on that kind of guy to bring home all the bacon, so that's natural, and that's how we should keep living. Now, all love and respect to my alpha brethren, but Neanderthals didn't live like that. As far as we can tell, whole Neanderthal crews supported themselves with surprising amounts of plants and also low-key industrial-scale food processing and supply chains, where women, children, and the disabled could pull in a lot of calories in a way that didn't even necessarily need hunters to supply them the bones, because you can render fat out of scavenged bones just as easily as you can from your own kills. So if we're talking about getting back to the basics of human nature, That's what the basics look like. People have just always been really creative with getting the most out of what we have. If there's any basic universal human truth about human nature to be had here, it's just that we do whatever works. Last thing before we wrap it up, I also really like to steer clear of this ancient people did this thing with their food for biochemical reason line of thought, like how we're using avoiding rabbit starvation to explain this fat rendering site. The biochemical reason is often something that we can see in hindsight because we do chemistry, but more often people did what they did with their food because it made it last longer or it tasted good. I see this line of thinking with nixtamalization a lot. That's the thing where you soak corn in lye. Us modern people get really excited about nixtamalization because it makes the niacin more available, and wow, the ancients were so smart and good at chemistry. Here's the thing. Early Americans probably nixtamalized their corn because it made it easier to cook and it tasted good. Most of the people who used nixtamalization were also eating a lot of fish and game that was high in niacin. So the fact that nixtamalization makes the niacin in corn easier to digest just wouldn't have mattered for most of them at all. This nutrient availability thing that nixtamalization did was just not as important for ancient people as we might think it was. How we in modern times convinced ourselves that early Americans did nixtamalization because of niacin is actually a crazy story that we don't have time for today. Maybe later. If you want to see that, let me know in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss it. I just want to say that, to me, using chemistry to explain why people cooked their food the way it did, it's a little bit like saying grizzly bears eat the eggs from salmon and leave the meat behind because they're trying to max out calories and get fat for the winter. Here's the thing, bears don't count calories. They're doing that because the fat in the eggs taste really good. Craving fat, sugar, and salt are survival instincts. The fact that they taste good motivates us to do the extra work to get foods that really pay off. We'll walk a little further to get to the good berry patch. If salt didn't taste good, our ancestors never would have taken the detours to the salt lick to get the sodium they needed to survive. And they probably wouldn't have bothered to crush down bones to render out fat that was both tasty and also happened to be good survival food when you need that kind of thing. I know it's very on trend to freak out about how we crave bad foods like salt, fat, and sugar, but getting pleasure and enjoyment out of eating high-calorie foods is why our ancestors lived to make us. It's a survival instinct. Now, it's one thing to recognize that these survival instincts to eat sugar, salt, and fat don't always serve us well in modern times. It's another to be afraid of those instincts. Which a lot of people seem to be. I keep hearing people say things like, there are food scientists out there whose job it is to make the perfect combinations of salt, sugar, and fat to make junk food addictive. The fact that we find those flavors compelling, it's not because they're addictive, it's not because they've chemically hijacked something in our brains. Liking sugar, fat, and salt is how our bodies are supposed to work because it kept us alive. That feeling, that enjoyment that we get from high-calorie foods, that is part of us. That's not something someone else is doing to us to get us addicted. That's literally how our bodies are supposed to work. When we eat something good and it feels nice, that's the voice of millions of years talking. It's a good thing. Now, do we have to figure out how to manage this good thing now that there's plenty of food? Yeah, and we're pretty new to figuring this out. We are maybe 1 to 3 generations in to an experience of learning how to manage this feeling in a time of abundance. But knowing how to manage a good thing is really different from telling ourselves that enjoying food, like evolution and or God intended, is an addiction, a disorder, a temptation, or a disease. Fearing that feeling as something new and modern and broken and foul that is taking us away from our roots. Craving high-calorie food is our roots. Also, yes, there are some scientists who work on the science of addiction and use that to make things more addictive. Those folks are out there. And what they work on is tobacco and nicotine products, because nicotine is actually addictive. There are scientific papers out there about how if you formulate vapes to make nicotine hit the bloodstream really quickly, to make your nicotine levels spike very quickly, then those vapes will be more addictive. People will keep buying vapes because gum and patches can't give you that same rapid spike in blood nicotine levels, at least not with the technology when that paper was written. So if you're worried about corporations that use addiction science to get people hooked on their products that ruin their health, there are literally corporate drug dealers out there doing that right now. Maybe worry about them.
This statement has not been endorsed by the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services.
What food scientists work on is things like, if we swap out this ingredient because the one we used to use is more expensive, how do we keep the flavor and texture the same? Or if we want to bake 3,000 loaves of bread an hour in this industrial conveyor belt oven, how do we get the belt speed, temperature, and humidity settings right so the bread gets baked right without wasting energy? That's the kind of thing food scientists work on. And that's because it really doesn't take a PhD to figure out what tastes good. Case study 1, barbecue, perfected centuries before food science was a twinkle in anybody's eye. I would even suggest that if someone thinks it takes scientific training to figure out what makes food taste good, that's a skill issue. And that's nothing to be ashamed of, okay? We can't all be good at everything. But let's not take a personal skill issue and turn it into a worldview where food tasting good comes from some scientist trying to bewitch you. Getting pleasure from high-calorie food is not a conspiracy. It's a survival instinct that we've been leveraging for millennia to make delicious comfort food. It's just kind of wild how our very still Puritan-influenced culture today has so much fear of pleasure from food that we can look at Neanderthals, who may well have been melting the fat out of bones out of pure love of the game because their environment was rich enough that they may not have had to do that, and conclude, yeah, that must have been a survival tactic for hard times. There's no other reason people would do that. Anyway, this is just a reminder that early humans were human. They took care of the sick, and they seem to have loved both art and fat. Relatable. Thinking everything they did was a grim survival tactic, that's usually us projecting our issues onto the past. It's not necessarily what their own lives were actually about. And that's a good thing to keep in mind right now, because we're getting bombarded with the idea that modern life is degenerate, less than, and we have to return to purer, more austere ways of life, to be true to ourselves, to really find our human nature again. Meanwhile, ancient humans and their real-life paleo diet was pretty omnivorous, probably more carbs and flavor forward than we like to think, and at least sometimes involved industrial-scale fat-rendering facilities. Also, they might have been hoarding art supplies. In conclusion, humans out there, you stay wild. Don't let the haters slow you down.